officers.
Welcome to another episode of the Dawn of Shades. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and today is August 17th, 2010, and it's episode 422. More about this program and the guests that are provided us with such fascinating conversations can be found on our website, www.exogenynetwork.com. Excuse me. Now, the Dawn of Shades always tries to bring interesting people right to the audience to hear about both new and old ideas. We focus on the people, places, and ideas that don't make the mainstream news, sort of things that are frequently labeled as alternative or paranormal. Now, for the show tonight, if you would like to have a question asked, you can email me at giascott@exogenynetwork.com or send it through the virtual auditorium on Pal Talk by text. I do monitor the email during the program, so if you're listening outside of the virtual auditorium and would like to have a question answered, please email it to me and I'll ask the question for you. Now, in the virtual auditorium, just put it into text and I'll try and catch it as the screen scrolls. And if I don't catch it the first time, please feel free to repeat it again. And for those of you who listen on a podcast, please go ahead and email me. I'll try and get your questions answered for you as well. And for those of you who like to feel connected, you can find me on Facebook and Twitter and link to me there. There's also a Dawn of Shades fan page on Facebook, so you can look for that too. For the readers and the foodies, check out the articles and blogs. You'll find some material that might interest you as well. Now, tonight's guest is of interest to anyone who has loved, wants to love, worries about money, and is alive. Now, that's a pretty broad spectrum, isn't it? She's an author and one of our favorite guests here on the Dawn of Shades. And recently she sent me an email with an announcement about some upcoming events. So, please welcome Claudia Dallaire to the program. Claudia, before we get started, just in case someone in the audience doesn't know who you are, you want to introduce yourself to them?
I'd be happy to. My name is Claudia Dallaire, and I am an author on all types of Egyptian magic. I have 2 books out currently, Egyptian Love Spells and Rituals, and Egyptian Revenge Spells. My newest book, Egyptian Prosperity Magic, will be coming out in July of 2011. I'm working on the revisions now, even as we speak.
Okay. And I heard tell that we might be able to find a novel as well.
Yes. Well, I have written a novel. I have written a mystery novel set in ancient Egypt, late New Kingdom, and I am currently shopping that around with publishers. One publisher had it, wanted an exclusive, and they decided that it wasn't going to be right for them, so now I've started shopping it around. And I'm excited.
I wish you the best of luck in that endeavor.
Well, thank you. Fortunately, I have several areas that I can shop it in. It's a mystery. It's historical. And there's also romance in it. So it covers a broad spectrum. And I'm hoping that I will just find the right publisher for it.
I'm sure you will. I have absolute faith. So that'll be fun to read it when it comes out.
It was fun to write. It's almost like creating a puzzle, because I knew the crime and I knew the solution to the crime, but then it's all the different pieces that you need to fit together, and it was just wonderful doing the research for the time period, and I just loved it. It was so much fun.
Yeah, I have to admit, the most recent novel I read was set in early United States. And the reason I read it was the author, someplace I read it, I don't remember where, but anyhow, she said that it was like she believed she'd channeled the book. Now, obviously, in the area that I have this radio program, channeling is of interest to me, and I don't I have to admit, I don't quite get the channeling thing. I'm not sure exactly what they mean, because they use it in such a strange way. Sometimes I'm kind of like, I'm not sure. So anyhow, I wanted to read the novel. It was a good novel. I have to get up and look at the bookshelf and see what the heck it was called. But it was a historical novel, and I know it's up here on the shelf, but whether I'll be able to spot it amongst all these other books. The Kitchen House, that's what it was called.
Okay.
The Kitchen House. Yeah, it was a very good novel. And I did enjoy it, and it was probably the first novel I had read in quite a while. I hadn't read very many novels here lately. So, it was an interesting book, and the channeling thing caught my interest, because there again, that just kind of, I'm curious. I mean, what is this channeling thing all about,
Well, I don't know if I can say that I really channel my book. But, it's kind of funny. I think writers are an odd lot, because I would go to bed after writing, part of a chapter, and I would be stuck on something, and I would try to sleep, and I would toss and turn, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, I would sit bolt up in bed like one of my characters was sitting next to me talking to me, saying, this is how the chapter needs to finish. It was almost like they were finishing the chapter for me. I would literally get dialogue from them, where the book should be heading, and I thought, maybe I'm losing my mind. Maybe fiction is not a good thing for me to do. Maybe I should stick with nonfiction. And then I'm fortunate. I have a couple of writers' magazines that I subscribe to, and I picked up a couple of the magazines, and I went through some of the articles on fiction, and another author said how her characters talk to her, and I said, oh, good. That means someone else in this world is as crazy as I am, so this is a good thing. So I figured I wasn't losing my mind.
Well, you really think about it, for the writer especially. If these characters don't come to life, they're going to look like, on paper, they're still going to look like cardboard figures moving through the motion.
Exactly. And what I wanted to do with the novel is I wanted to make it a standalone novel, so that if a publisher wants to publish just this one novel, they'll be very happy with it. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. But at the same time, I love the characters so much that I've actually planned out a series based on the two major characters and following their life. Now that they have reconnected, they grew up together, they were in love when they were children. Of course, ancient Egypt being what it was, he went off to, fight campaigns in the military, and now he's back, and he's still in love with this woman, and she's still in love with him. And now that they have found each other, now, they're going to start a life together, and I thought, wouldn't that be nice for a series? So this pretty much is the first one, and when he comes back, because he's a military man, he is appointed in charge of their police, which was called the Magi, and now he's going to solve crimes in Thebes. So, it seemed like a fun book, and I loved writing it, and I really like the two characters. They interact very well with each other. So I would like to do a series.
Well, it sounds quite interesting. Now, as far as the book that's coming out about prosperity,
Yeah.
You know, in this economy, there's not a one person listening, probably, that's not suffering from impaired cash flow.
Yes. Absolutely. We all are.
Yeah, you know, my impaired cash flow went from anemic to positively sort of a sack of nothing.
Yeah.
We recently got hit by lightning, and that destroyed computers, and that was an expensive little storm. And it was the first clap of thunder. There hadn't been a single rumble to forewarn anyone. And it was raining, but, you know, on the Gulf Coast, rain is sort of the name of the game.
Sure.
It rains all the time. Yeah. And, you know, they, first clap of thunder, my screen went black. That's not a good thing because I was actually using the computer.
Yep.
And I said, you know, there's a battery on this. It shouldn't have gone black.
Oh.
That was the end of mine.
Mm.
It wouldn't power down. It wouldn't do it. In order to power it down, you had to take the battery out. It powered up just fine.
Oh, yes.
But the screen stayed black.
Yeah.
So I got an estimate on repairing it. It was $50 less than the original purchase price.
Yes, because I know exactly what they would do to it. They're going to have to replace the motherboard.
The motherboard and the screen.
Mm-hmm. That happened to a laptop that I had. And I cried because I loved my laptop, and I could power it up, but I couldn't power it down without removing the battery. Oh,
yeah.
And it's frustrating.
Oh, yeah, you know, you could hear it. It sounded like it was booting up just fine. It went through all the appropriate sounds.
Yep.
And then it would go into that mode waiting for the password, which, of course, I couldn't give it because I couldn't see a screen.
Yeah.
And no, I should hook it up to an external monitor. It's possible that the motherboard is fine.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you know, it's also possible that an airplane will fly over and drop a sack of money in my yard. Those are probably equally likely.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well, you know, I can do some of those prosperity spells. You know, maybe send me a preview.
You know, I can do that. I will email you a prosperity spell.
You know, like I said, you know, a little bit of help might come in handy right now because, like I said, that airplane hasn't dropped that sack of money yet. Well, keep looking out the window into the yard, and it's just still full of water.
Oh, isn't that awful? Oh.
And we've had a little bit of rain on the Gulf Coast here lately.
And like I was telling you, where I am, I'm in Arizona. We're in our monsoon season, and I live close enough that I can see the Superstition Mountains. And I watch the clouds, and they get to the Superstition Mountains, and I get very excited because I think, oh, good, we're going to get rain. And it rains in the Superstition Mountains, and the clouds come over the mountains, and there's no more rain. So
yeah, I remember my days in Arizona. You could watch the storm coming. You could see the rain falling. You could smell the rain.
Uh-huh.
People don't believe you when you said the rain evaporated before it made it to the ground.
And it does. It does. I've never seen anything like it.
It's quite devastating. You know, when you're...
Yeah.
I actually have to admit, one place I lived in Arizona, we had not had rain in our house in over 12 months.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it sounds like, you know, I'm making it up because it rained around us.
Mm-hmm.
But it didn't rain at our house.
Sure.
For over that 12 months, you know. And
sure.
I lived in, got, 6 to 8 inches of rain a year, I believe, in northern Arizona. And the Sonoran Desert gets 3 to 6 inches of rain a year.
Yeah.
We've had that much rain in the last 2 to 3 days.
Well, I remember I was living out here from 90 to 94, and we had a neighbor. She had a little boy. He was 3. Now, of course, his first year, he wouldn't have really been cognizant of the weather. And from 1 to 2, he probably wasn't too terribly concerned. So here he was at 3 years old, and it started to rain. And he ran outside, and he's yelling, "Mommy, what's this?" And she said, "Oh, that's rain." He had never seen rain. I don't know what he would have done if it had snowed.
Well, I can tell you, having raised a daughter up until 6, we lived on the Sonoran Desert. And when she took a trip with her grandma and great-grandma, they were in the mountains in Colorado. And it was early spring, and there was still snow in patches on the ground. And she wanted them to stop so she could go run barefoot in the snow. Well, they did. So she could go see the snow. Well, they knew she'd never seen snow.
Sure.
Well, she had as a baby, but she didn't remember that.
Sure.
I have a picture of her all bundled up in a snowbank. And one time my mother fell we were at the homestead where my mother had been born.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother was carrying the baby, which was my daughter at the time, and fell in the old back house hole.
Oh, no.
But anyhow, she didn't remember that trip at all. And so this particular time, she runs through the snow, which is like 20 yards away from the road where she's parked and her grandmother and great-grandparents are. And she goes running into the snow, and when she gets to the edge of the snow, she stops and she takes off her shoes and socks and goes running into the snow.
Oh.
And she's 4. At that point, she promptly starts crying because snow that time of year, as anybody who knows mountain snow, the crystals are very large and hard and sharp.
Oh, yes.
And they really hurt cold little 4-year-old feet.
Sure.
But she kept that. We eventually moved to northern Arizona where we did get snow every year.
Yeah.
And it didn't stick around very long, but it fell every year.
And
every time the snow would fall, she would have to run out barefoot through the snow.
Oh.
And there's nothing more pathetic than these little tiny footprints running through the snow around the house. But, yeah, she's still, for snow, I bet you, and she's 28 years old now. I bet you the first time she sees snow, every time, she does the same thing. Runs barefoot in it. Yeah, but yeah, she was just so shocked that snow was not as soft as it looked.
Yeah, it's not that nice, white, fluffy stuff. No, I know. I lived in New England, and after it, thaws and freezes and thaws and refreezes and thaws and refreezes, then it's like white concrete. Well, kind of gray concrete.
Well, I grew up in the northern plains, and after a blizzard, the crust on top was so hard that you could walk on it.
Yeah.
And every January, I'll admit I did this too, we would run around the block in the small town that we lived in, barefoot, in sub-zero temperatures. And you had to run fast so that you didn't get frostbite on your feet. And by the time you got home, you were leaving pink footprints.
See, that's where she gets it from.
Yeah, my brother and sister and I all 3 did that. And why we did it, I don't know. But we did.
Oh, that's funny.
Yeah, it's one of those things I guess kids do. Just like I can remember breaking through the ice to go swimming one last time in the fall. Be all frozen along the lakes on the edge. You'd break through the ice to get into the water. You couldn't swim very long. Your fingernails and your toenails and your lips would start turning blue.
Yup.
And then you would run home as fast as you could and take a hot shower. It's a miracle we never died of pneumonia.
You're from tough stock. That's what it is.
Yeah, it's just that was what we did every year as teenagers, preteens, and insane. I think about it. What would I have done if my kids had wanted to do that? But things change, okay? There's all these comments. We grew up, we drank out of the water hose. That's a no-no now. We swam in places that would never meet standards today. Gravel pits? No, that's not safe.
Oh, yeah.
Stock tanks. Yeah, even our swimming pools were not filtered or purified or anything. I mean, public pools were, but, the little pools you had in your backyard weren't.
Oh, sure.
We didn't wear helmets on our bicycles.
No. Or knee pads or...
Seatbelts? No. I remember the car seat my little sister was in, it had these hooks that went over the seat itself. That's all that held it in place.
Yeah.
Just these hooks.
Yeah, exactly. And, and the same with, I know we're really obsessed with germs now. Oh, everything is antibacterial and anti-this and anti-that. And I remember, your kid would drop their pacifier and you'd just kind of, run it under hot water and stick it back in their mouth.
If you were outside, you just wiped it off the glass and stuck it back in their mouth.
It's not going to kill them.
Yeah, I can remember one time, this is probably kind of a gruesome story. I was helping kill some turkeys.
Okay.
And my mother was doing the head lopping duty.
Okay.
And she told me to kneel over the turkey so it couldn't beat her with its wings. Now, these are big turkeys. They dress out at like 30 pounds a piece.
Yeah.
So they're huge.
Mm-hmm.
So I get the turkey, and I've got it by the chop block, and I kneel over it. She gets the head, and off comes its head. She forgot one minor detail, because I've never helped kill turkeys before. Other birds, yes, not turkeys. She forgot to tell me, when I chop off the head, jump back quick.
Oh, no.
That neck came back and into my face, eyes, nose, mouth, squirts blood. The blood in your eyes really, really stings.
Oh, yeah.
Blood up your nose just, you can't really breathe. And in your mouth, it just tastes like blood.
Yeah.
Right beside me, this is there again, this is highly sanitary home butchering conditions. Right beside me in the stump where we're killing the turkey is a cow tank, which is a large galvanized metal tank filled with water and has this puffy, foamy-looking moss grows on top of it. And the cows slobber in it and, birds poop in it and the whole bit. That's where I wash my mouth, nose, and eyes out in.
And
guess what?
You survived?
I didn't die. I didn't even go blind. Yep.
Yeah, I often wonder how we did survive. I remember as a kid eating a mud pie. Gee, that's what you did when you were, 4, 5.
Okay, well, I made them, but I wasn't into eating them. I can still remember my brother eating them and then spitting it out in disgust and saying, "That's mud." And I'm like, duh.
Yeah, pretty much. But, I had a cousin who, had this affinity for worms, and
I can remember cousins.
But he used to like to pick up the worms and look like he was going to eat them, and I always thought that was pretty rude. But, gee, we all survived.
We were the country cousins, so we were really awful. Okay, there's no other way to put it. We were awful. The city cousins would come to visit. I can remember one of them. We tormented him unmercifully, but he spent the entire weekend he was at our house, sitting in the chicken house, waiting to see a chicken lay an egg.
Oh.
I cannot imagine a more boring way to spend a weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just not that entertaining. But to him, it was highly entertaining. And they would come and they would think that, we had black and white cows, and they were mystified what kind of milk they would give.
Oh,
and where was the chocolate cows and where was the vanilla cows?
No, it doesn't work that way.
No. Then came strawberry milk, and I guess those come from pink cows.
Pink cows, yeah. Those are the pink ones. But you have to have a few drinks to see those.
I thought that was pink elephant.
Well, maybe it applies to all livestock. Who knows?
Yeah, it could be. I have to admit, I have not seen any pink cows. I have seen some horses that really kind of looked pink, but they were albinos, and they were so the pink would show through their hair.
Yep.
So yeah, I guess that doesn't really count.
Oh, that's hysterical.
But yeah, the times really have changed. And, when you look at ancient Egypt compared to modern America, you can't help but say, how can a spell from ancient Egypt possibly have any validity in modern America?
Well, see, what I know this sounds kind of weird. Well, maybe it doesn't. I'm a pagan, and what I believe are pretty much the same things that the ancient Egyptians believed in. There is magic in everything, and that's what they believed. They believed that there was magic all around them. Now, their spells, however, were geared toward a bountiful harvest, the birth of healthy cattle. I don't really need to be birthing any healthy cattle, but thank you for asking.
Well, I guess the way I always looked at it is big crops and healthy cattle and goats and sheep and camels and whatnot. That really just translates to prosperity.
Correct.
That was how they measured prosperity.
That is correct. So what I did is I took their basic spells and their beliefs, and I've updated them so that if an ancient Egyptian came out of the Cairo Museum tomorrow, one of the mummies came back to life, and he opened up this spell book, he would recognize them, and he'd say, wow, things have changed. Because they had, number one, the Egyptians had no money. Money did not exist in ancient Egypt. Theirs was a barter system, plain and simple. They did have gold, but gold was not what we think of as today. Gold was used for jewelry and ritual cups, and, it wasn't something that you traded for. The average Egyptian never would have seen gold. The priests would have, the nobles would have, the pharaoh, he would have been surrounded by it. The average Egyptian, gold meant nothing to him. Silver, I have now learned, was a very precious commodity in ancient Egypt. They valued silver more than gold because it was harder for them to get. They didn't have silver in Egypt. They could get in Nubia, which was part of the Egyptian kingdom. So gold to them was, one ancient philosopher wrote, gold was as plentiful as grains of sand in the desert. So, that's why they made everything out of gold. It was there. It was easy to obtain. So silver was very precious to them, and which is why you don't see a lot of artifacts made of silver. They used that to combine to strengthen tools. So you would mix it with copper or you would mix it with gold to strengthen the metals that you were working. So you didn't have a lot of silver. Silver was very precious. Copper, another thing they had abundance of, which is why most of their tools were made of copper. It wasn't a big stretch for them. But because they didn't have a monetary system, everything was bartered. And they were pretty smart about this. Everything would be weighed, and they had an actual system of weights and measures that was, all throughout the land, so that if someone from Phoenicia came in to trade, everything got weighed, and, the weight of this was equivalent to, like 4 sacks of grain, or a wooden bed, or a quantity of ebony, or so that they had equivalencies that you could barter for. Okay. Life is good. So if you raised crops, you were a farmer, and you had an abundance of grain, you would go to the marketplace and you could barter that for linen, fabric. You could barter it for jewelry or perfumes or unguents or whatever else you needed, or a new pair of sandals. Life is good.
Uh-huh.
So their prosperity was very different from ours. Their prosperity was, if the Nile overflowed the way it should, it would bring prosperity to the entire land. Everything was, it wasn't prosperity for one, it was prosperity for all.
Uh-huh.
It didn't matter if the king had everything. They didn't look at him as being wealthy, because in their mind, the king was the son of Amun. He was a god in their eyes. He was the living embodiment of a god. He should have everything. So they toiled away, building his temples and, supplying the food and working in the fields for the good of the country, because he represented the country. And everything was distributed evenly throughout the land. So if, one of the farmers had a bad crop, but the farmer next to him had a good crop, it really didn't matter, because it was all going to get put in the granaries and everyone was still going to eat. There's the key. Everyone shared. It was, it was for the common good.
Uh-huh.
So their big thing was the Nile had to provide. And as long as the Nile provided, life was good.
Yeah.
So that
I do recall reading somewhere that salt was used as a measure of trade as well, like used for payment for labor and stuff.
Oh, yes, salt was very important. They used salt in mummification. They used salt, obviously, to season food. But salt was also used for cleansing, for cleaning your teeth. And in cooking, because I'm pretty sure they also used it in making bread. So salt was very important, and salt was also very plentiful. And they would. Salt was a good commodity for that. Salt, grain, linens, I'm trying to think of, and a lot of it, and I found this very entertaining, a lot of their bartering was based on the system of, it was called a deben, was the weight that was used. And it was based on debens of copper. I guess copper copper would have been easy for an average Egyptian to obtain, which is probably why it was a deben of copper as opposed to a deben of gold or silver. So the deben was what they based a lot of this on. So it was pretty interesting to learn all of this and how they traded with, say, the island of Cyprus for wine, or the Phoenicians, or in Mesopotamia with all of the different cultures there, the Babylonians, the Hittites. And, everyone wanted to come to Egypt and trade, because Egypt was the big kingdom. And so everyone wanted to trade with Egypt, and so that was really good too.
Yeah,
so they were prosperous. So prosperity to them was very important. So every year when it was getting close to the Nile, the inundation, which signaled their new year, all the priests would be in the temple making offerings to the gods, because you wanted to have a good inundation so that you would have a prosperous season. And most times they did. They did have bad years. And there is history where for even, 10 or 12 years they had, bad inundations. And, everyone suffered. It wasn't just the average Egyptian. Everyone suffered, even the king.
Uh-huh.
So, and because the people saw that the king suffered, they didn't feel like, he was asking them to sacrifice something that he wasn't willing to sacrifice, which is probably why their system of kingship worked as long as it did. Their civilization lasted over 3,000 years.
Yeah, we can only hope the United States lasts that long.
Yeah, how many civilizations can boast that, they've lasted over 3,000 years under the same type of government? So they had something going for them. They, had a good system there. And of course, let's be realistic. In all systems, there are abuses. You have, and they kept wonderful records. There are court proceedings of overseers who were not giving out grain to people, so the people would take him to court. And so even an average Egyptian could bring a court case against someone who was of a higher status than him. So they
Weren't there even some cases where after the pharaoh died, whether he had help getting dead or not, they attempted to erase any trace of their existence?
Oh yes. It's funny you mentioned that, because the novel that I wrote is set in that time frame, which is Ramses III. Now, Ramses II was Ramses the Great, who everybody knows. He died at, he was in his 90s. He reigned for 67 years. Everybody knows Ramses II. Ramses III, who's not quite as well known, which is when I set my novel, he had a conspiracy against him. One of his lesser wives wanted her son to become pharaoh upon Ramses' death. But he wasn't next in line. So she figured if she killed the king, she could have her son take over the throne, which wasn't going to happen anyway, because there was another son who was destined to take over, and he had been named Crown Prince. But somewhere in her mind, she figured if she killed the king, and she had help from some of his guards, some of his priests, it was quite a conspiracy. There were, I think, over 50 people involved in this.
Mm-hmm.
They stole sacred books from the temple library so that they could do the magical spells. They made wax figures of the king so they could kill him. And he did die. Now, whether it was because someone poisoned him, whether their magic worked, they were real hung up with magic, because everything was magical to them. However, it's difficult from reading the court proceedings if he died from their magic or if he was still alive when the case was brought to trial. It almost sounds like he fell ill from this, and he died like 2 years after the conspiracy. But his son, the Crown Prince, is the one who was presiding over this. So the theory is that he was just too ill to stay pharaoh, so the Crown Prince was his co-regent at the time. So it's very interesting. But they didn't have a lot of that. The Romans and the Greeks were famous for, well, we want to take over, let's just kill Nero, or let's just kill Caligula. The Egyptians didn't do that as much, and I think I know why. And that's because their king was a god to them. You wouldn't kill a god because you would be destined to eternal death, which was the worst thing that could happen.
Uh-huh. It wasn't. I was under the impression that King Tut died as a result of violence.
Well, he did, but I don't think it was at somebody else's hands. It almost appears that, see, he was only 18. He was still young. It almost appears that he was out chariot riding because that was fun. And, of course, they didn't have roads. And if you fell out of a chariot, you could be killed. They didn't have the same type of medicine, and certain traumatic injuries, there was no way they were going to save you. So if you struck your head just the right way, or if you broke your neck, or if you fractured a leg and you were out in the desert heat for 3 or 4 hours before someone realized, oh, the king is still missing, let's go look for him.
Uh-huh.
It's very possible that that is what killed him, as opposed to someone actually killing him.
Yeah, my mother broke her neck in a riding accident when she was a teenager.
Mm.
Not everybody's as lucky as her. She lied to her mother about how she did it, and she never went to the doctor.
Yeah, and, I mean...
You think about it, and, breaking your neck and not even going to the doctor.
Yes. See, she was very fortunate. Look at the actor, Reeves, Christopher Reeves. He broke his neck in a riding accident. He was paralyzed
and he didn't
for the
walk
rest
again.
of his life. Exactly.
Right.
So, depending upon the type of injury, where it occurred, the type of treatment you get, and of course, you have to remember this is ancient Egypt.
Right.
They had medical care, certainly not what we have today. So,
yeah, well, if it's anything like ancient Western medicine, sometimes you were better off with no treatment.
Uh-huh.
At least that wasn't going to kill you.
But, they did have some very good treatments. I mean, there were certain things, let's be realistic, were beyond them because a lot of their medicine was also magically based. They felt that, take these herbs and say this incantation and it will drive the evil spirits from your body. No, that's not going to work if you have cancer or if you have tuberculosis. These are not going, this is not a valid treatment. But at the same time, they also didn't cut people open. So they didn't autopsy bodies because that would be considered desecrating a body. You couldn't desecrate a body in ancient Egypt. The body had to remain whole so that the person could be reborn in the afterlife, which is why they mummified. They would remove the internal organs and preserve them, but they didn't know how the organs functioned. And they would have known that only through surgery and autopsy, which they didn't do. So a lot of their treatments were very odd if you look at them, but a lot of them were very sound. They could heal broken bones. They knew how to set a broken bone and heal it. And a lot of people survived very well. They knew how to amputate a limb. They could even create a prosthetic limb that you could use. They even did, and this one just, two of the things that they did just, I read them and I cringe. They have actually found mummified remains where someone has had a hole drilled into their skull, and it is a healed hole, which means the patient survived having the hole drilled into their skull to relieve pressure on the brain.
Mm-hmm.
With no anesthetic. They didn't know about germs, so I'm sure they probably didn't cleanse anything. Which, I read that and I'm like, I wouldn't want to have that done now, let alone have that done 2,500 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And, what did they use for anesthetic? And they also, and of course, most ancient cultures, I know the ancient Jews did, the ancient Israelites, I think a lot of the Mesopotamians did, but the ancient Egyptians circumcised. And when you circumcise a baby, I don't have a problem with that. Okay, you've got anesthetic now, he's not going to remember this. In ancient Egypt, it was a rite of passage, and the priest would take you to the temple, and you would be circumcised around the age of 12 or 13. And I read that, and I was like, oh, that just got to be painful.
Yeah.
So, but apparently people survived. So they must have known what they were doing, but I don't know how, and I don't think I really want to know how. But they were way ahead of their time in a lot of ways.
Uh-huh. Well, it certainly would be a rite of passage that would loom large in a young boy's life.
Yeah,
and remain a deep and profound memory.
Yeah, and you couldn't serve as a priest if you weren't circumcised.
Yeah.
That was because there was a lot of ritual purity to being a priest. Their entire bodies were shaved. That's another one that I just love. I would love to know I know they used, I think it was like flint and copper blades as razors.
Well, I know that you can sharpen quartz to the point that, yes, you can, in fact, shave with it. The microcrystalline quartz is the sharpest blade. It's actually, today, it's still used in some surgical applications.
But what did they use on the skin? That's going to hurt. I'm assuming they probably used some sort of an oil, maybe olive oil, so that the blade kind of went over the skin without just ripping you to shreds.
Yeah.
So I read this, but the priests shaved their bodies pretty much every 2 days because they had to remain ritually pure. They bathed 4 times a day. And I'm reading all of this and I'm saying, wow.
Yeah.
Oh. So there was a lot involved in all of their religious practices.
Now, were there priests like the Catholic priests of today, and always male and always unmarried?
Nope. Not at all.
I was just curious if that was something that had tradition way back or not.
The high priest, who was pretty much third in line after the pharaoh. The pharaoh was the top guy in ancient Egypt. Below him was a gentleman called the Vizier. He generally was always a guy. But he often was a son of the Pharaoh. So, of course, what's going to happen? He's going to become Pharaoh one of these days. The high priest, and, of course, you had a lot of temples. So all the high priests weren't necessarily going to be sons of the Pharaoh. But they were just as powerful because religion was very important. But the high priests, most of them were married. Most of them only had one wife. You hear of course, the Pharaoh had a wife and a lesser wife and maybe concubines, and some of them had really big harems. Good. But that was also part of their religious belief, because the Pharaoh was seen as the vitality and the fertility and the prosperity. Fertility and prosperity equate in ancient Egypt, which is why Ramses had 150 children. He was like a rock star to these people. You know, I mean, look at how prosperous we are. Our king is, I mean, they called him a bull because bulls were a symbol of fertility in ancient Egypt. So he was, you know,
hot stuff,
he was hot stuff. Everybody wanted to know Ramses. He was, you know, he was a rock star. What we would equate today with, you know, some person that we idolize. He was, you know, the big celebrity.
You know, sometimes you can't help but look at the American fascination with celebrities, be they movie stars, TV stars, or rock music stars. And we do. They're like high priests and pharaohs and people. You know, and I say we in a very loose thing here because I personally don't, you know, I won't get that involved in it, but we do devote a lot of time, a lot of attention, and an immense amount of money. I'm like, why would you spend that kind of, you know, I was reading someplace that you can get, you know, various stars, be they sports stars or whatever. Like Tiger Woods will give you a private lesson for like $200,000. I'm like, come on now.
See, that's really nice. But
you know, Madonna will give you a private concert for so much, and so much will, you know, so and so will come to your party, and I'm like, oh yeah, okay.
I have a little problem with that because they have a talent, and they are using the talent that they were either born with or that they have nurtured. And I think that's wonderful because they're using it not only for their betterment, but if you're a talented singer, then you put out an album. I'm sorry, a CD. I keep forgetting.
Well, it's still in a sense. I think they still use albums.
Again. And other people enjoy it, so you do it for other people's enjoyment. And I think that's wonderful. And I'm certainly, I will never be Stephen King, but I look at Stephen King, and he's brought me many hours of enjoyment. I love a good horror.
Many hours of terror, too. I have to admit, the book that bothered me the most was Pet Sematary, because in that book, the cat he talks about, we had one that looked just like it and was the most demonic cat imaginable. This cat attacked me every morning. You know, and this book did bother me. You know, there's only been, and the book called The Wolfen, which I guess is by Whitley Strieber.
Yeah.
Those two books really bothered me.
But now
the movies, I thought the movies were terrible.
But now you don't see or hear of Stephen King in the news every other day. No, and you know, I haven't seen a price for having him show up at my barbecue next week either, you
know.
And I know that he donates a lot of money to the libraries in Maine because his big thing is promoting literacy. There's a concept. You know,
yeah.
Unfortunately, some of our, what we, term heroes in our society don't promote what they should be promoting, like staying in school, getting an education, not having children.
Well, some of them I have
13.
to look at and say, I really kind of wonder about what they're promoting and the value that they have for our society.
Exactly.
I mean, we went through the certain young blonde routine, and I'm thinking, please, thank God my daughter never held her up as an idol because this girl's a mess.
Yeah, I want to grow up and have, 2 illegitimate children by the time I'm 17 and be a rock star. Oh, great!
But hold that thought because it is time for us to take a break. So, while we're away from your computer, folks, check out our website, www.exogenynetwork.com, and stay tuned, and the Donna Shades will return with our guest, Claudia Delaire. I'm your host, Gia Scott, with our guest, Claudia Delaire. And once again, I would like to remind everyone to visit our website, www.exogenynetwork.com. You can sign up for the newsletter and wander around, explore the website, let me know what you think of it. There are links there to take you to blogs, Twitter, and even Facebook. And if you want to go straight to the blog, it's giascott.wordpress.com, and you can find out what kinds of things I'm up to lately. Now, if you have a question that you wish to have asked tonight, you can email it to me at giascott@exogenynetwork.com. I am monitoring the email during the program with Claudia tonight and trying real hard not to miss anything. You can also, of course, send it to me through the virtual auditorium on Pal Talk. And don't forget, for those people who are listening on a podcast, you can always email the question to me, and I'll try and get it answered for you, too. Now, Claudia, before we go off on our 101 tangents, since we have lots of tangents, well, you want to tell everybody where they can get your book?
Certainly. The first two, Egyptian Love Spells and Rituals and Egyptian Revenge Spells, are both available on Amazon.com. We love Amazon. And I know that the second book, which just came out last year, has also been carried in Borders and Barnes & Noble. So if your local store doesn't have it, I know they can get it for you. And the new book that's coming out, Egyptian Prosperity Magic, which won't be out until next year, I'm afraid, July of 2011, will be available at most major retailers. It will also be on Amazon, and I do believe, I'm hoping, but it looks like it may also be available as an ebook.
Ooh, that would be cool.
Yes.
Since I have downsized living quarters, I have discovered I am a hoarder. I have more stuff than I have room for stuff.
Oh, I think we all
And I love to be able to refer to magazines or books. However, when you're space impaired, you really have to prioritize what you keep and what you don't keep.
Yes.
And so an e-book and magazines. I love magazines in the e-format. Recently my computer was destroyed, lost all my old magazines. I log in, I punch in my password and username, and bingo, I've got them all back again.
Isn't that wonderful?
I think back, in the old days when you lost everything, it was like when I had a house fire. I did lose everything. Those magazines and books were not recoverable with a click of a few buttons.
Exactly. Isn't it?
And I do. I really like it. It's good for the environment. It's great for people who like to refer to old ones. People who read it once and they're done, it's probably not as big a deal, too.
Exactly.
But I do. I like to, I refer back to a magazine article, especially, cooking and whatnot. I do a lot of cooking, do a lot of crafts, and I do, this, that, and the other thing. I may want to look at an article I remember reading in such and such a magazine 4 years ago. As a matter of fact, I am looking for an article that with a recipe for a macadamia fruitcake.
Ooh.
And it was in a Better Homes and Gardens Christmas edition, like in 1984-85. You think I can find that thing anywhere?
Heck
Not even
no.
from Better Homes and Gardens. I even emailed them and asked for it, And I know someplace in a file it still exists.
Oh, God.
I just haven't been able to find it. At this point in time, you kind of miss the old microfiche days.
Yeah.
Because what you would do is you would look for those magazines
for
the years I was concerned about, and you would actually look at the table of contents.
Yep.
And you could see, okay, that's the one I want, and that's the pages I want. And you send off your request and your $1.50 or whatever it was for the copies, and boom, you had a copy of the article in 2 to 6 weeks. Yeah.
Yep. Oh, yes, I know. Well, I'm curious because I know when I was living back in Massachusetts, I do research on all kinds of different books. I was researching an old murder case that happened near where I lived, and it happened in 1901. And I was actually able to look at newspapers from that time because, of course, they either microfilmed them. Some of them were actually bound in these absolutely enormous books that they used to have, the nice, big, tall gentlemen bring up from the basement. I wonder if libraries keep magazines on, microfilm.
I'm going to have to go prowl a couple of different libraries and see. The one I checked before, I'd had zero luck, and I really haven't checked again in the last decade. So, it might be worth my time to try again. Yeah, a lot of times it depends, too, on who the librarian is, on how much cooperation you get.
Exactly. Yeah, I used to try to go at 7 o'clock at night when it was really quiet, and I got to know one of the librarians pretty well, and I said to her, I'll be coming in probably about once a week for the next couple of months. And she said, if you want, she said, I can keep this book, because it was, these bound editions from 1901. She said, I can keep this right here at the desk for you, and you'll just have to ask if I'm not here. No, she didn't have to do that. She was very nice. So every week I would go and see my librarian, and sure enough, the book would be there for me, and she and I would carry it over to a table because it, it was big and bulky and heavy, and it was wonderful. So if you get the right one, oh yes, they're very helpful. Now, before we broke, you had asked me a question about the priests in ancient Egypt. Were they kind of like Catholic priests, or actually, like any of the religious people that we think of today?
Yeah.
And no, they weren't. because, number one, priests in Egypt were married. And although we...
Now, Claudia, could you speak up just a little bit?
Sure.
We're having a little bit trouble hearing you.
Sure. Although we normally associate, the Pharaoh had, as I said, either one wife and then multiple lesser wives and concubines. Most people in Egypt had one wife. Most men in ancient Egypt had one wife.
Okay.
So your high priest would be generally married. Most people married in ancient Egypt. And he would have children. And generally speaking, his son would then become priest when he died. It was kind of a hereditary position.
I was curious about that. As far as, their other children, assuming that one son would follow them into this priesthood, were the other children apt to go into other trades or become lesser priests or what?
They could also become a priest in the temple or a priest in another temple, or they might become a scribe or an official with the administration. They might become, say, head of the chariotry or head of the army, or they might be a general. So there were a lot of options open to the noblemen and their sons. They could pretty much be whatever they wanted to be, but they had to go to the temple school and learn to be a scribe because you had to be able to read and write if you wanted a good position in ancient Egypt, which, gee, that sounds
That hasn't
familiar.
changed much.
Yeah, that hasn't changed much. But in the line of, in a sense, being religious, some of them took their duties very seriously. Some of them were very religious. Some of them looked at their service in the temple as a way to be a big man in town. Gee, some things, again, don't change.
Yeah.
Because being a priest afforded you a lot of status. Because you were privy to things that other people did not know. You didn't actually worship in the temple. An average Egyptian would never set foot in a temple. Only priests were allowed into certain parts of the temple. So it wasn't like what we think of today as a church. You wouldn't have had services, so to speak. The Egyptian priest, the high priest, would go in every morning, and he would, I know this is going to sound very odd, he would wake up the god because there was a literal, almost life-size statue of the god in every temple in ancient Egypt, and you would awaken the god, and the statue would be bathed, and it would be anointed with perfumes and unguents, and it would be dressed, and it would be given food, and that was to start the day, and you would feed the statue 3 times a day, and you would burn incense and chant, and the evening, when you brought food the 3rd time, then you would close up the sanctuary and literally put the god to sleep. I know that sounds kind of odd, but...
It does. I mean, didn't you ever notice that the stone statue, I'm assuming they're stone, didn't eat much?
Well, I don't think they were... they probably were stone, or a lot of them were gold.
Okay.
It's not so much that they noticed that the god didn't eat the food or didn't speak, or they knew that this wasn't the god. It was the representation of the god, and in their mind, the god could inhabit that statue, their essence, their ka, could inhabit that statue at any time.
So you better be prepared.
Correct.
Good Boy Scouts, right?
Now, of course, another good reason to be a priest was you're not going to waste all of that food. Food was very important in ancient Egypt. So after the god consumed the essence of the food, then the food was distributed to the people who worked in the temple. So you ate pretty good.
Yeah.
Ate like the
It
god.
smells better than the average guy, too, I bet.
Yeah, exactly. So being a priest was a very important role in ancient Egypt, so you kind of wanted to be a priest. But I have also discovered that the only people who really served the temple full time in the priesthood would be like the high priest and the administrator of the temple. There were, key positions, and their primary responsibility was the temple and, its functioning, because the temple had cattle. The temple owned cattle and land that the food was raised for the god. And you had weavers, and you had musicians, and you had goldsmiths, so this was like a town in a town. So it had to run smoothly. This would take up all their time. So certain key figures in the temple served the temple all the time. The rest of the priests would serve on a rotating basis. They would serve the temple for 1 month every 3 months. So 4 times a year, you would rotate into the temple, and you would serve as a priest. The rest of the time, you might be mayor of whatever city you lived in, or you might be a scribe, or you might be a merchant, or you might be something else. You might be a soldier. But for that 1 month, you were a priest. So you would go in and you would do your priestly duty for a month. And during that month, you were at the temple, and you had to abstain from sex with your wife, because you couldn't enter the temple if you weren't ritually pure. So you had to abstain from certain foods, certain activities, and you had to shave your body completely and bathe 4 times a day. And so there were a lot of things that went along with being a priest, but it wasn't necessarily a religious calling as it is today. It was.
Well, these high priests, now they were there all the time, right?
Yes. Well, I have a feeling, I thought about that, because I'm saying, well, if they're not supposed to have sex,
how did they do that?
How are we going to have kids? I have a feeling what they probably did. I know a lot of times the high priest was also a high-ranking official in his area. So I have a feeling what happened is the second in command, which was usually he was called the second prophet, he probably took over duties when the high priest had to do something else. And probably part of that something else was going home to see the wife and kids for a while.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. Or it could be like a lot of other instances that have occurred in historic times, and I'm sure occurred before that and whatnot. What you say you're supposed to do and what you do may not have a lot in common.
Well, I was just about to say that. This is the way things were supposed to be. And I'm sure if you were, that 1 month that you rotated in, and you were actually, some of the priests actually lived in the temple. There were temple apartments there. So if you were actually living there, not a problem. if you maintained your own home, which the high priest did, and, a lot of the higher officials, you're not living at the temple. So who's going to know if, gee, maybe you fell off the celibacy wagon last night? Who's going to know?
Right.
So,
it was a miracle,
That sounds terrible. But again, in ancient Egypt, children were very important because they were considered a gift from the gods. You wanted to have a lot of children, and the infant mortality rate was very high, which is why you married young and had a lot of children, because at least half of them would die before they reached the age of 10. So, a boy would generally marry by the age of 15, and a girl usually was about 12 or 13. And it sounds really awful when you think of that. I would not imagine that today. But at the same time, a female's function in ancient Egypt was to run a home. She wasn't really going to have a job necessarily outside of the home. Her job was going to be running a household. And that was a job in itself, because bread had to be baked every day. She had to brew beer. I think they loved their beer.
Uh-huh.
And she was responsible for weaving the clothing that was made. You didn't just go out and buy cloth. She would sit at a loom and weave, and then she would create whatever clothing. So, it was a full-time job.
Yeah.
And she was the one responsible to go to the marketplace and barter for what it was they needed. Sometimes she might actually, do extra weaving or create, say, bead jewelry and sell it in the marketplace. If, of course, you were a noble woman, then you might actually have a job. Some women did. There are a couple of recorded cases of women being physicians in ancient Egypt, which I found very enlightening.
Weren't there also cases where they were pharaoh or they were regent for the pharaoh?
Yes. There were, I think, 5 of them. There weren't a lot of them. It definitely was still a male-dominated society, but women were much more equivalent to a man than in most ancient societies. Women could own their own property. Women could leave their property to anyone they wanted to. They didn't have to leave it to their husband. They could leave it to another relative. If they had children, say, by a previous husband, they could leave it to them. They could institute legal proceedings. They could get a divorce on their own. They could sign contracts on their own. They could own their own businesses. There were some women who owned businesses. I think there was a woman who was a quote-unquote tavern keeper. And some women were boat pilots. So they were a progressive society in that respect. Most women preferred to stay home and have children. It was kind of easier that way. They kind of knew what they were in for. And, of course, if you were a daughter of the pharaoh, you kind of had life made. You would be taught singing and dancing, and you might be taught to read and write, and you could become a priestess in the temple. They did have women who were priestesses, usually in temples for Hathor and Bast, but they did have priestesses in the temple of Amun. So this was something that you could aspire to. and they had women who were musicians and dancers in the temples, and so they did have real work. They didn't just, and there were a lot of times there were women who were weavers to the temple.
Uh-huh.
And they would prepare paint for the tombs, or they might make lamp wicks. So they did have a variety of things they could do. It was very interesting.
Well, compared to a lot of cultures of that era, it sounds like women had considerably more freedom.
Oh, yes. Even because I just read this recently, Herodotus, when he had gone to Egypt, he was absolutely shocked, and this was really late in Egyptian time, because this was when there were a lot of Greeks in Egypt. He was absolutely shocked that women were allowed out without their husbands. In Greece, a woman would never be allowed out of the house unless accompanied by her husband or a chaperone. In ancient Egypt, women could come and go as they pleased. In Egyptian society, it was never even considered that a woman would do something unseemly. I guess the Greeks didn't quite think that way.
Yeah. Well, they might say more about the Greek men than the Greek women.
Maybe. But
it's hard to say. And it could be a case of safety. Maybe in the eyes of the Greek, any woman who was out without a chaperone was essentially a prostitute.
Yeah, maybe that's how they looked at it. And, it's kind of tough to tell if there was actual organized prostitution in ancient Egypt. It's the world's oldest profession, so there probably was. And I have read that a lot of the female temple musicians and dancers, a lot of them would give out favors for a price. So it's very possible that a lot of them did this kind of under the cover of the temple. So that, it's not like they kind of hung a sign out. But we do know in Greek and Roman society, they did have brothels. So whether they had brothels in ancient Egypt, I don't think they've ever found any. Doesn't mean they didn't have them.
Right.
Because adultery was kind of frowned on in Egyptian society because it called into question the legitimacy of your heirs if you didn't know who the father of your child was. But let's be realistic. If
it occurred now, and it occurred then.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, how many times do we read in the paper that, Governor so-and-so or Senator so-and-so or Representative so-and-so has had a secret mistress for 10 years?
And we know that it was going on with kings and queens in Europe, and it was going on with dukes and and so forth and so on. Anybody with any position, it appears that the town pauper never had an affair.
Exactly. So we're sure that this went on. They may have just been more discreet about it, but there are cases in ancient Egypt where a man is brought before the magistrates because he was having relations with a married woman who was still married at the time, or, that he was, there was one man who I guess was having relations not only with his wife, but with his neighbor's wife and his neighbor's daughter, and I mean, it was awful. I mean, this guy was kind of going through town, I guess.
Yeah.
So this did happen. And I don't know what his punishment was, but I know they could be kind of harsh about things like that. That was just not a nice thing to do. So he, you know, I mean, they might have cut off his ear or his nose. I guess that was one of the punishments, because that kind of branded him, so that you kind of knew, oh, you don't want to go near him. He's not a nice person. But, you know, that, and they did, there was another punishment. They would use banishing. They would banish you for a period of time. Or you might be incarcerated for a period of time. You know, I don't know if they've found jails. Maybe they incarcerated you at the military barracks, where they kind of kept an eye on you for a period of time. And they were big into having you make restitution. So you would work, and whatever your normal earnings would have been donated to the temple, because everything went to the temple. So.
And then everything went from the temple to the pharaoh, apparently, for a large
pretty
portion.
much. Yeah. And it would be, but again, it would be distributed to everyone. So it was, I hate to say this, it was kind of a socialist society.
Yeah, it does sound like a rather socialist form of government.
Yeah,
you know,
pretty much.
Even though they had deified their king or pharaoh, it still was somewhat of a socialist type government.
Exactly. Well, but see, the king was supposedly descended from the gods. That's, you know, he was seen as a god. So he was ruler of Egypt, but at the same time, he was kind of better than the Egyptians, because his quote-unquote bloodline would be traced back to the first supposed ruler of Egypt, who was the god Osiris, who brought civilization.
You know, I know
to
they've
Egypt.
done a lot of research with DNA on the mummies, as much as possible anyhow. Have they established that they were, in fact, all related?
Oh, heck no. They weren't. But how a lot of them made their legitimacy known was through good public relations. That's what the temples were for. They would erect a temple to the god Amun, who is my father, and you would, you know, depict scenes of him being present at your birth. So your birthright is as the son of the god. That's why you're the pharaoh.
Ah, okay.
Pretty sweet, huh?
Yeah, so you didn't necessarily have to be related to the most recent pharaoh if you could establish that you were the son of God.
Well, let's say the pharaoh died and had no heirs. Someone's got to be pharaoh. You're not going to have a kingdom that size with a vacuum in the government. That can't happen. Generally, the pharaoh would either appoint someone if, you know, he was getting on in years. He might declare someone the crown prince and then adopt him as his son, and that was perfectly legal. They adopted back in ancient Egypt. So then, literally, you were son of the god. Lucky guy. So, no, they weren't all related. And if you only had a daughter as an heir, that was okay, too. Because generally speaking, the eldest daughter of the pharaoh was very often married off to whoever was going to succeed the pharaoh. And usually, you know, they talk about brother-sister marriages.
Right.
And in the royal family, yes, that happened, but they weren't necessarily, they were more like half-siblings because they were usually not the same mother. Same father, not the same mother. Still not a good thing.
No, but it's not as genetically risky as full siblings.
Correct.
Would be.
But see, all of their mythology was tied up in their god Osiris, who was the first pharaoh of Egypt, was married to his sister Isis. She was the first queen. So they looked at this as, well, that's what the pharaoh does. So whoever is going to succeed pharaoh, well, that's okay. Now, the normal average Egyptian would have never married his sister. That was not done. You would marry whoever your parents thought was a good match for you. And it usually wasn't your sister. So that was okay, too. So it was primarily only in the royal family, because that was okay. That was their mythology. The first king married his sister, and they brought civilization to Egypt, and they gave the Egyptians everything they needed. They brought music and weaving and agriculture and religion. They brought everything to the Egyptians and established order. And that's what the pharaoh does. So that was okay.
Well, actually, when you look at Egypt, it's really not as distant and foreign as you would think it should be, perhaps.
Exactly.
It's like same old stuff, just new names.
Exactly. But, when you really sit and, I've been researching Egypt now for over 10 years. And now I'm branching out into other ancient cultures, the Phoenicians, the Mesopotamians, the Minoans. A lot of them had similar beliefs. They were all pagans. They all worshipped a number of deities because their outlook on life was a lot different. To them, rain was a god. They didn't necessarily understand the entire mechanics of rain, so therefore it must come from a god. Same with thunder and lightning. They're not going to understand where this comes from. We understand it now, but they didn't. To them it was magic. So it had to come from a god. So although they worshipped all of these gods, a lot of them had one major god that all the gods came from. So when we say they were pagans because they worshipped many deities, you're absolutely right. But most of them did have one main god, like Amun, who kind of superseded all of them. He was kind of like Father God. Is it really that different from what a lot of other religions believe now? The Catholics believe in God, but there was also God the Son and God the Holy Spirit, and then you have the angels, and they can perform miracles, and so can the saints. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people go to churches named after a saint, and what do? They light a candle and say a prayer to that saint. How different is that than lighting a candle to the god Boss, who's the god of writing, and say, gee, can you help me with the book I'm working on?
Well, yeah, but it's not politically correct to pour it out. But it is common. It's common knowledge, really, that the Catholic Church along the way adopted a number of pagan ways to make the new religion more palatable to the natives.
Absolutely.
And it makes good, propaganda sense.
Yes, absolutely. They
But
built churches on pagan sites, so the pagans would still come there, and then they would say, yes, you can worship. You're just going to worship this god now. And the pagans were like, okay. I mean,
and it's a saint instead of, this, that, or the other minor god.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I remember as a kid, my aunt would go to church, and she would light a candle because she had lost something, and she was calling on St. Anthony, who would help you find lost things, and it was always called offering a bread to St. Anthony. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, where's the difference here?
Right, yeah, you're not supposed to notice those sorts of things, especially as a child.
Yeah, I know. Well,
it's a bad political decision in adult juvenile relations,
Well, I didn't notice it as a kid. I mean, I would go with her, and we would both offer a bread to St. Anthony. You slid the dollar in there, and you lit the candle, and you prayed that you would find your lost keys or whatever it was that you lost. And when you found it, well, then you went and lit another candle because you wanted to thank him. And now, as an adult, I'm looking back on this and I'm saying, and this is different from paganism because he's not a god, he's a saint. Okay, I get that concept. But how is this different?
Right, as a child, I had to learn the gift of silence because I had made the mistake several times of saying what I was thinking before I had time to clamp the lips shut. And, it always landed me in trouble.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it just wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
Because I guess I always had a rather peculiar view of the world with religion, and religion and I had some early conflicts. I guess if I've had multiple lives, I've probably died in the Inquisition, and I really questioned everything.
Yeah, I became rebellious in my senior year in high school, which was not a good thing because I went to a Catholic high school.
Ah, yeah.
And when you start questioning their authority at, the age of 17, it doesn't bode well.
No, 17 must be a good age to just sort of bust out, though.
Oh.
I see it quite often. I think about back when, I was 17 when I started busting out and becoming a real pain in the parental behind.
Yeah.
And, my daughter, she perfected long before 17. I have to admit that. She was always a little precocious, but yeah, she had perfected that art. By 17, we had it down to a science,
And I had help because George Carlin was getting very popular then. And I used to love listening to his Class Clown, and I will never forget, he used to say, he would, raise his hand in class and he would ask, if God is all-powerful, can he make a rock that he himself cannot lift? Well, I just had to try that one out.
Oh, that didn't go over well.
Principal's office for that one. Because the priest did not see the humor in that. It's like... it was kind of downhill from there.
Did you manage to stay in through the entire senior year?
Yes, I did. Matter of fact, I graduated in the top 10 of my class.
Yeah, I spent the first semester of my senior year trying to get suspended. I failed. No matter what I did, it seemed to never go any further. They were all afraid of my mother.
Oh.
And so then the second semester, all I cared about was graduating.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that's 17, that magical age. There's a reason why 17-year-olds are still minors.
Yes.
We have the ability at 17 to engage the brain only partially.
Yes.
And the mouth is always in gear.
Oh, yes. And there was, and you know, I look back on this and I think I'm so shocked that I didn't get thrown out of school, because I remember the day I said to a priest who was teaching us, of all things, marriage and the family, and I boldly raised my hand and said, "Excuse me, Father, but are you married?" "I'm married to the church." I said, "Okay." And at the time, we had a couple, a married couple, who were teachers at our school. And I said, "Well, why aren't Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so teaching this class instead?" And he said, "Well, no, I teach marriage and the family." I said, "Do you have to make a budget and raise children and worry about where the kids are going to college and when they're going to ask you for the car?" And, you know, I started, listing off things that married couples are going to have to deal with. And I found myself very shortly again at the principal's office.
Speaking of the principal's office, guess what?
Yes?
We have run out of time. I do want to thank you for coming on tonight and being such a fun guest.
Oh, I love coming on and chatting with you.
Yeah, it's always fun. So, folks, I hope that everyone has enjoyed the program with Claudia tonight, and hope that all of you have found that it provided you some food for thought and more illumination for your personal journey towards truth. Join us again next week for another episode of The Dawn of Shades. Sure to be another fascinating conversation with our guests. With that, we are out of time. I'm your host, Gia Scott, and good night.